Hello, and welcome to the Responsive Family Sleep Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Hawley, holistic sleep coach, lactation consultant, peaceful parenting educator, and mom. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by all the conflicting sleep info, frustrated with sleep information that just plain felt wrong, or searched desperately for a truly gentle and responsive sleep approach, then you are in the right place. In each episode, we'll be answering your most pressing baby and toddler sleep questions, busting those sleep myths, and helping you understand truly developmental, biologically normal baby and toddler sleep, plus encouraging you to trust your intuition along the way. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to this week's podcast episode. I am really excited to have a guest on to be talking about processing your birth story. And I feel like I have lots of thoughts and feelings around my own birth stories and birth story conversation and processing in general. So when I saw Jaely talking in our local birth worker group about her work with birth story medicine, I got really excited. I was like, "Oh, come on my podcast." So I'm so happy to have you here chatting with me today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So why don't we start off with you sharing with folks a little bit about your work, and then we can jump into why we're even having, this conversation about processing your birth story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a mom of two. I'm based in Northern Virginia. I'm a perinatal educator. I'm a birth story listener, which I think we're going to be talking primarily about today.
Mhm.
I'm also a full spectrum doula, and I own Our Village Circle Birth Services in Northern Virginia. We provide birth, postpartum doula services. We also provide childbirth education classes. We have an online postpartum preparation class. And we also offer birth story medicine sessions and one-on-one consultations for birth and postpartum preparation.
I love it. I love it. I feel I was about to get sidetracked by your postpartum class, which looks amazing, but we can talk more about that at the end.
Yes.
So let's, just start off with why processing your birth story matters, or maybe why even your birth story matters, taking it a step back. You know, why is that an important part of our transition to parenthood?
Yeah. Well, birth inherently, regardless of how it happens, is a major rite of passage
Mm-hmm.
in our lives. And I'm sure all of us can remember, or even maybe not even if it's not conscious, we can remember it in our bodies, the feeling of growing up hearing birth stories, whether it be maybe your mother tells you the story of how you were born every year on your birthday. I've had a client who said that that was kind of how she learned about birth. Maybe it was the scary video in health class was your first
Oh
exposure.
God.
Maybe it was all the talk about teen pregnancy and how to avoid getting pregnant. Maybe it was like your aunts and your mom and your grandmother all sharing their birth stories. And we all know that when we become pregnant, we inherently become this receptacle for other people's birth stories, and they're not always positive.
Mm-hmm.
People do tend to share the negative stories more than the positive, in my experience.
Yeah.
The folks who have had positive experiences often feel really hesitant to share because they don't want the people that had bad birth experiences to feel a certain way about it. So, birth inherently, just societally, is this loaded topic to begin with. And
Mm-hmm.
so then when we become pregnant, sometimes we carry those stories with us as we move through our pregnancy, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And our preparation for birth actually began when we were children. It began when we were born because we were all born.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that also it plays into how we navigate our pregnancy, how we navigate our birth experiences, the choices that we make. And most of us have an idea in our head of how birth may unfold or how we would like birth to unfold. And when something unexpected happens, or if it doesn't go the way that we had hoped, or if there was a moment where we felt like we lost autonomy, or
Mhm.
if a nurse came and spoke to us in a tone that was very activating for us, those things can linger with us as we then go into our postpartum period where there is this giant hormone drop. And we now have the responsibility of this new person in the world that we are caring for. And we have visitors and we have medical staff coming in and out. And we just went through this giant thing that within 24 hours sometimes has already become lost in the hustle and bustle of life with a new baby.
Yeah.
But we need the space to unpack that story. It's very, very important, regardless of how the birth went, whether it was in your mind a positive birth, or maybe it was traumatic, maybe it didn't go the way that you'd hoped. We need that space to be able to integrate that story into our being. It was a very major event. I can guarantee you, no matter how the birth went, it was a major event.
I love that you said integrate there, because I think that, like, for any major event in our life, our ability to integrate it is so important to, like, our emotional state and probably our physical state moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And with so much in turmoil in early parenting and so much focus then being on, no, cute little newborn and baby, it's like we have to hold space for the positive, right? And hold space for maybe what wasn't positive.
Yeah.
In part also so we don't go around traumatizing other people with our birth stories. Like,
Absolutely.
as I feel like that is a big piece of the, like, horror stories that you, as soon as you get pregnant, you start hearing, oh my God, all these awful things, because we aren't holding space for that to get integrated healthily. And honestly, I hate talking about my birth stories because they don't fit nice and neat into any boxes.
Right.
And depending on what group I'm in, I know I'm going to get various reactions that I don't particularly want to deal with unless I'm actually, friends with you, that there's a
Right.
point to talk about them. Like, the general public, I'm just gonna be like, oh, they're gonna cringe because I planned a home birth, right? Like, didn't have
Right.
it, but planned it. And then, like, you get in the natural birth community, and sometimes they can be kind of judgy if they never experienced anything that took their plans off route,
Right. People
And
have
so
very strong opinions about birth. People
they
have
do.
very strong opinions about birth.
Mhm.
And the truth is, it's a very individualized process.
Yes. Both what you want it to look like and how you make decisions, but then also what you find as traumatic, I feel like
Yeah.
is really individual as well.
Yes.
And that's something,
Yeah.
like,
And that
I dealt
plays
with a
into
lot.
that plays into the history of your life, like what you've been through as a human being. Like we're all individuals.
Hmm. Yeah.
But the birth process, like, in that time after the birth, off, like I said, it's very, very busy. There's people coming, if you're in the hospital, there's people coming in and out of the hospital room nonstop. And I'm not talking about like family visitors, I'm talking about medical staff. And then you add in family to that. And of course, there's this excitement of the new baby. Everyone's oohing and ahhing over the baby. If people want to hear about the birth, often all they really want to hear is whether or not you got an epidural and whether it was a vaginal birth or a cesarean birth. But
Maybe how long it is, right? Thrown in there
right.
if
And
it's
maybe
like
how long
particularly
you were in
fast
labor. Right.
or,
Exactly.
or long.
People don't really want to sit with the other stuff, and maybe they don't know how to. And so often what will happen is there will be these platitudes, right? All that matters is a healthy baby.
Ooh, yes.
Well, at least everyone's healthy. And like while yes, those things are absolutely true, there is space for both. It's a yes and, but the and often gets swept under the rug. And then new moms who maybe didn't have the birth that they hoped, they feel like they have to squelch and really shut the door on those feelings of disappointment and guilt. And we know that when we shut the door on certain emotional experiences that are trying to be expressed, it will express itself, but it will express itself
Mhm.
in other like maladaptive, really unhealthy ways. And so, psychologically speaking, there is actually a series of stages that birthing people go through after the birth of their baby. I talk about this a lot in my online postpartum class, but I can go over it really briefly
Yes,
here.
please.
There's 3 stages. The first stage is called taking in, the second stage is called taking hold, and the third stage is called letting go. I'll talk a little bit about the first stage here because it's relevant. In that taking in stage, this is typically the first like 24 to 48 hours after the birth. And during that time, the birthing person, because they have just given birth, is very highly dependent on others
Mm-hmm.
for everything, bringing them food, taking a shower, caring for the baby. You'll find they're a little bit more passive during that time. They're also taking in the new human. They're taking in the features. They're identifying the newborn. You'll see them like stroking the face and like looking in the eyes and really kind of just integrating, this is my offspring. I need to remember what my offspring looks like, sort of thing. And this is like instinctual, animalistic, like evolutionary. But also, you'll often find that in those first 24 to 48 hours, the birthing person is also trying to piece together what just happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, I work as a birth doula. Oftentimes, in that immediate, like 2 hours after the birth, I will see the mom. The first things after the baby is born and they say hi to baby and all, where everyone's good. The first questions out of their mouth are typically, "How long was that? How long did I push? How long was my labor? How long was transition?" Like they're just trying to really piece together what happened. And then what you'll notice, and I'm sure a lot of any postpartum nurses that are listening to this could probably back me up on this, like they want to share the birth story with everyone who walks in the room. They want to tell it to everyone who walks in the room. Now, sometimes if it was a traumatic event, we don't see that quite as much, but sometimes we do. But it is this natural process of like trying to integrate the trauma and trying to like disperse that energy. We see when animals are being chased by predators, they run and they hide and all of that. Once the threat has cleared, one of the first things they do is they shake it. They physically like shake out that trauma. Now, animals don't have words. So for them, that's like one way of dispersing it. And actually, like after we give birth, most people shake for a bit. And that is your body like, and that's a symptom that people are really surprised by, but that is your body like dispersing this excess adrenaline. And that act of like also telling the birth story is another way that our minds and our bodies are trying to integrate to disperse that extra adrenaline. Everyone makes lots of adrenaline when they give birth. They need it. But then what do we do with the extra? And so this like taking in process, like I will often see people are wanting to share the birth story, but often there's not time because birth certificate is coming and going. They just want to know baby's name. Nurses just came in to do rounds. They just wanted to make sure the baby ate, peed, and poop and that your vitals are good. They don't want to hear your birth story. Visitors come in, they're admiring the new baby. They don't want to hear your birth story. Your partner doesn't want to hear your birth story because they were there and they're processing their own thing, right? And so it is, the birth story is something that gets lost. And regardless of how it went, it's a story that needs to be told.
Yeah. And I don't know what you notice from the birth story listening side of things, but I find then you get in these new mom or new parent groups, right? Maybe 6 weeks out, maybe 3 months out, maybe even down the road. And then like not always in healthy ways, but maybe sometimes in healthy ways, we get like bits and pieces of people's birth stories coming out.
Yeah.
And then even years down the road, like I was literally, my youngest is 6, and I was at a birthday party for one of her friends because she won't let us drop her off at birthday parties. And like all these moms start talking about birth stories, and I'm just like,
yeah, like they do.
and I'm like, in this sitting, I did not really want to participate. So I'm like, I'm going to step out because y'all really don't want to hear my birth stories, and I don't really want to tell them to you.
Sure.
So I'm just going to nod along. No one, by the way, knows that I have above average birth literacy, and I'm just gonna nod along and be like, oh goodness, that sounds,
I've been there.
yeah, like, you mean you had a spinal headache after that epidural? Oh goodness, yes. Okay, I'm just gonna
yeah, and it's hard if like you had an atypical experience that no one can really relate to.
Yes, it is, and that would be me across the board. no
Mm-hmm.
typical births for you. So I think it's interesting how we want to share and then sometimes how we conceal different aspects of our birth experiences, sometimes both at the same time,
Yeah.
um, and sometimes not, like one or the other. And I don't know. I don't know if you see that a lot too, but I just know that my own personal experience. Like sometimes I'll be like, oh yes, my first was breech too, but I'm not going to talk to you about like anything else about that because like that's the easy outward facing story versus like,
Right.
you know,
Well, and it is
the
this
rest
whole
of it.
labyrinth, right? Like it's a slippery slope, because oftentimes a lot of these details can be hard to explain, and sometimes we don't even understand what happened because we're not birth professionals.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like this is something I've noticed amongst my clients because when I'm working with a family on sleep, one of the questions I'm asking is like the general outline of their birth story, right? Because
Yeah.
how babies brought into the world can impact babies' physical well-being and it can trickle over into sleep and then obviously with parents and mental health issues and stuff like that. So I feel like there's the I think you were saying earlier, right? That emotional suppression, if we don't have the space to process and integrate the birth story, that can come up later. But like I've also found sometimes there's like compensation, like birth really didn't go how I planned. So it's really important that lactation goes as planned. And then we can kind of,
Yes,
you
that was
know,
my journey.
yeah. And that can be double trauma if then we have lactation complications, but
Yes.
also can be very healing if it does go smoothly, even if birth was not smooth and
Yeah.
as planned.
Yeah, because inherently we're trying to gain control somewhere because we've lost control.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we're clinging to things that were important to us that we didn't have control of in the birth process, then we're like, what can I take control of or prioritize or use to be like an identity marker of the kind of
Yeah.
parent that I thought I was going to be or want to be or the way I thought birth was going to go? And really focus on those pieces that you still have not control
Right.
over, but like ahead of you to still work on when it's like, okay, birth is done for this child. Um,
Right. And it
and
is
so,
important. It is important. And so, sometimes when we hear things like, oh, all that matters is a healthy baby and all of that, like there's a bit of it's tainted with shame a little bit.
mhm,
Right. And so I've seen before like that can inhibit people from continuing to share their story because then they feel like no one gets it. And even like I've worked with folks before who have also done talk therapy to process their birth stories. And this was also my experience was, in trying to process the birth story with a licensed therapist. And like, I love therapy. I go to therapy every week. I am I think that birth story medicine can be a wonderful supplement to talk therapy. It is not talk therapy.
mhm,
But what's unique about it is that at least for my services, like I am also a birth doula. So I have that extra insight. I've been in the room many times. I've seen many different ways that it can go. And so
mhm,
like being able to tell the story to someone who is familiar with the birth process, who is familiar with the birth space, who can really like paint that picture in their head and understands the
mhm,
dynamics of an OB and a midwife and an operating room and the sound of a fetal monitor, even, like
mhm,
someone who can really like enter that space with you and really understand it makes such a huge difference. And like, a lot of therapists have given birth, but there is something different about sharing the story and talking through the story with someone who is in that environment on a regular basis. Because sometimes, it's called birth story medicine, and we have this like um, metaphorical medicine cabinet, so to speak, of different things that may help. Sometimes the medicine is education.
mhm.
Sometimes it is, I don't understand what happened. And
Yeah.
sometimes it is, we go into a whole lot of different things, but the benefit is really in someone who understands the birth space And
Yeah.
like I said, this is not at all knocking therapy, and this is not at all saying like birth story medicine over therapy. I think that the two can work really, really beautifully together.
That makes a lot of sense. Like my favorite people for processing my own birth stories were with my midwives.
Hmm.
Um, Midwives for my second and third birth who were at my birth, but for my first birth, when I went to go hire my second midwives for births moving forward, was processing how my first birth was handled. And I can imagine with someone, trained to from that birth story medicine angle, like how helpful that would be. Because I know what part of was helpful for me was I was talking to somebody who knew what they were talking about birth, right? So like we
Yeah.
really could debrief.
Yeah, it makes a really
Um,
big difference. And,
yeah.
it's not unusual for someone who finds themselves pregnant again for that, like sometimes it lives in the background, like that first birth story, it lives in the background until we become pregnant again. And then it dawns on us, we're going to have to go through this process again.
Yeah.
And that's where we start realizing, oh, wow, like I really have been carrying this. And I find this a lot, regardless of how the first birth went, a lot of a second pregnancy is processing that first pregnancy and that first birth experience. Because as we know, every pregnancy is different, every birth is different.
Hmm. It's funny, not funny, but like a parallel. I feel like people who have particularly intense postpartum periods or particularly intense first years. I feel like you need to do that same thing sometimes with early parenting before you go on
Yes.
to have another child because it's that same, the people with the babies that have all sorts of stuff going on with them or are really intense, highly sensitive babies or had a lot of digestive issues or other things that make it not your average hard, like really, the ones that wake forever and are super hard to settle and things like that. I feel like it's that same, you have to kind of
It's
let
so
go and
hard.
integrate the story, right? And
It
then
is. And I
take
had
the
one
new
of
one.
those kiddos. My first was a very highly sensitive dude. And I noticed it like in the first weeks.
Mm,
And our first, like, our fourth trimester with our first was not a typical experience. And we didn't really know that until we had our second. And it was like night
hmm.
and day.
Yeah. Because you don't know, right? When it's your first
You don't
baby.
know. And
Yeah.
like he is a highly, our first, he is a highly sensitive kiddo. And so we understand why now. But at the time, we thought everyone was experiencing what we were.
Hmm.
And then when I would go to mom groups and be like, oh my gosh, like, he only sleeps for 45 minutes at a time. And then like other parents are looking at me like I have two heads. I'm like,
Hmm.
oh wait, your kids don't do that? Like it can feel very isolating. But yeah, we did have that experience of like after we had our second, we really noticed the very, 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 very stark differences. And that was when we began to process our first postpartum experience. And now we recognize that that was like very not typical.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like when I'm talking with folks about having second babies or third, babies down the road from their first, when they've had that kind of highly intense, obviously generally sleeper for me, but the highly intense sleepers usually have high intensity or sensitivity in other areas. I'm like, you gotta not carry that forward, right? Like not
Yeah.
carry that stress or I don't know if trauma for some folks, but fears, like
Yeah. There's
anxieties,
a
feeling
feeling.
like if we did this differently, we could have prevented this when it's like, no, actually, you can't always prevent these
Yeah.
things.
And I see that, that's really like the bargaining stage of grieving
Hmm.
is when we see that, where it's like, what could I have done differently? Like, who's to
Yeah.
blame for this? And this is like a very normal part of the process. And sometimes I do feel like we can beat ourselves up for even doing that in the first place.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's a real thing.
Yeah. I don't know. Tell me if you feel like, generally speaking, this is helpful, but like I know when I was processing my first birth story and how it unfolded, I was like, okay, could this have gone a different way? Like, did I actually have viable other choices? My first flipped breech at 39 and a half weeks. Just he was head down. We were planning a birth center birth. He flipped breech at 39 and a half weeks. And he's 11 now. So this was different birthing landscape than is now in DC. And I remember like going back, I'm like, did I have other options? Did my midwives not tell me all my options? Like, because that was really scary for me. And like just that piece of like, were there actually other viable choices? And that's sort of on paper a very straightforward situation as compared to much more complicated birth stories that can unfold where it's like much more nuance and many more places where those choices, there could be more choices or could not have been more choices. And
Right. And
it
often
was
what
helpful
I
to think through it.
find, yeah, and often what I find it comes down to when people have something like lingering over their birth experience is this inner conflict between, and I think we all have these parts of ourselves, but the victimized, wounded child in ourselves that is very outwardly focused on like what could other people have done differently, who's to blame, like what other people did to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part of ourself, which is the self-judge, the self-critic that wants to search for like what you could have done differently, how you
Mm-hmm.
failed, how you didn't do it right. Right. And each of
Mm-hmm.
them like have their own purpose and good intentions. But when they become in conflict with each other, it turns into this revolving door of like, well, I could have done this. Oh, you should have done this. Oh, well, the midwife should have done this. And it's this like, who's to blame, you or other people? And it
Mm-hmm.
really becomes this like spiral of like, you're trying to express a hurt, and then the self-critic is coming in and blaming you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that inner conflict is. So, like, the birth story medicine process is really at its core a teasing apart of these two different aspects of ourselves and letting each of them have their own space in the room without being interrupted by the other,
Oh, I love that.
so that they get their full expression, because that's where the turmoil is that one keeps interrupting the other and neither get to fully express themselves, and that's where we get stuck.
Mm-hmm. And anytime we get stuck somewhere, it's not good. We're not going to move to
Yeah.
that point of it being integrated and being able to healthfully like move forward, right?
Right.
It's so interesting. That is so interesting. I know we've kind of been weaving through this and talking about it throughout the whole episode, but I feel like this is such a powerful place that if we could honor in so many different levels the space for birth stories, we'd all just move into early parenting in a healthier place. I mean, like, obviously, I think there's
Yeah.
a whole conversation around the actual birth system and how if we did not traumatize people so much, we would not necessarily have so many people moving out of birth traumatized. But
Right.
also,
That's a discussion for a whole different episode.
exactly. And also, sometimes you are with amazing caregivers and you still have a traumatic birth. It's not
Yeah.
like that simple. And so, like, you can have had wonderful care providers and been very well prepared and still have things happen that
Yep.
you need to process.
Absolutely.
And so it's
And
like that.
even the positive birth stories need to be processed. I do these sessions as well for like people feel the need to share their birth story. And sometimes it
Yeah.
just feels good to someone, if they had a positive birth experience, to share it with someone who's going to be right there with them and celebrating with them and hearing the whole story. It's just a process of
Mm,
integration.
yep. And not invalidating or trying to bring it down or trying to like one up. I feel like people sometimes one up with their birth stories, not necessarily always
Yeah.
intentionally, but like that kind of unhealthy sharing that can happen
Yeah.
sometimes. So I can see that. Yeah. Like wanting that safe space to just be like, this was amazing and
Yeah. Yeah.
I
And
want to
I love
celebrate
those
it.
sessions. I love all of them, but like I love those sessions too. And I love when people actually like value themselves enough to give that gift to themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I've
Because,
also done these sessions for folks who have experienced, like, it's called birth story medicine, but I really do consider like everything from conception to like postpartum to be part of the birth story. So, like, I've worked with folks before who maybe haven't given birth yet, but they have a lot of trauma around fertility struggles or multiple losses
yes.
or
Yes.
breastfeeding struggles afterwards or something traumatic that happened in the postpartum wing. Like that was the case with my birth story. Like I was traumatized, but it wasn't in the actual birth. It was something that happened in the postpartum wing. I still consider that to be part of my birth story because that was like my story of becoming a parent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I could see this with lactation stories, right?
Yeah.
Like
So many people have trauma around breastfeeding.
so many,
Hmm.
so many. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I can absolutely see that. And I think like the more that we can hold space for integrating all of those experiences, like I love that you highlight it right from like conception and fertility through loss, through the birth, sort of what we think of, through, the postpartum, through like feeding journeys, like that whole time is such a vulnerable time. And
Mhm.
so I feel like we're so much more susceptible to things hitting us harder because they're
Yes.
also such an important time. But like the more that we hold space for that processing, again, the more we can kind of step into parenting healthier, like
Yeah.
more. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but I think you know what I mean.
Well, yeah, when there is a veil of unexpressed whatever regarding a birth story or a perinatal story, often it kind of creates a little wall between you and your child. Like I see this a lot. Like there will be difficulties with bonding, there will be difficulties in
Hmm.
relationships, there will be difficulties relating to other parents. And so it creates this wall. And what we want to do is lift that veil so that we can be present for our kids, so that we can just, I mean, like even, and I hate saying stuff. It's like, oh, you need to heal so that you can be a better parent, because in my mind it still is kind of like, oh, you're only important in relationship to your child, and that is something that, like, that's a narrative I would love to stop. So, even like really do this because you're inherently worthy of not carrying trauma around in your daily life,
I love that. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I feel like that's such a good place to wrap the conversation actually, because like, what I really like my number one thing I wanted people to take away from this episode is like that there is a lot of power in processing your birth story, right? It's like not just okay, we're done, it's past, we're over it. Like there's just so much power and healing and value in honoring that time, that transition, and having someone hold space and really processing it and not shoving it aside. Uh,
Yeah.
you
And this
know?
is something I also have really enjoyed doing for birth workers who are in that space on a regular basis and who witness so much. And
Oh my goodness,
inherently,
yes.
that is something that we carry into our work. And I want to make sure that, like, as birth workers, we're not carrying trauma from someone else's birth into the next client's story,
Yeah, absolutely.
because that
Absolutely.
also influences the care that people receive. Like it's a trickle down sort of effect.
I feel like that's something that like OBs and midwives need more space of too to process
I know
their
I do. I offer a
product.
discount for birth workers, and like I do this for OBs and midwives and
That's
doulas
awesome.
and people who see this every day.
Mm-hmm.
And also people who have given birth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So as we wrap up, do you feel like there's any piece of birth story medicine specifically, or of processing your birth story that didn't come out in our conversation yet that would be helpful to sort of leave folks with?
Just that it's important,
Mm-hmm.
really. I think so, it's very easy to begin to feel like it's not important
Yeah.
very soon after the baby arrives. So I want to leave people with the message that your birth story is important, and
Mm-hmm.
sharing it is important for you as a human being to feel integrated in your life as a new parent.
And it's never too late, right? I mean, you can go back and process.
Never. I have done these sessions for folks who gave birth 40 years ago,
Oh, I love that.
and it's very powerful. They didn't realize that they've been carrying that around for 40 years.
I love that. I love that. Jaely, why don't you shout out a bit where folks can find you? They can find your birth story listening and all your other awesomeness.
Yeah. So I am on Instagram at Our Village Circle. Depending on how many births I'm taking, like I'm kind of, sometimes I'm on a lot and sometimes I'm on just a little bit. So you can find me there. I also have a website, www.ourvillagecircle.com. And under the services tab, that is where you can find information about birth story medicine, and that you can actually schedule your session right from that page.
I love that.
And so these happen over Zoom. They're about an hour to 90 minutes, give or take. And we sit down together and we unpack your birth story. And usually in just one or two sessions, the process, it will help you unpack your story and bring insight and resolution and really allow you that freedom to move forward in your life with greater ease. So you can book a birth story medicine session right from the website. I also have an online self-paced course called Preparing for a Smooth Postpartum. And you can it's 2.5 hours if you watched it from top to tail, but it's broken down into 5-minute modules. So you can do it at your own pace and your own time. And really with that course, you're learning the stuff that they don't tell you about postpartum life and recovery. And my hope is that you will enter your 4th trimester really feeling informed and confident and prepared. We discuss the golden hour. We discuss hormones, your physical, emotional healing, nourishment. What does the return to movement look like? What does the return to sex look like? How's your relationship going to change? How are your friendships going to change? How do you rally your community? How do you set boundaries with visitors? And a lot more. But I'm really proud of this course, and it makes a really good baby shower gift, actually.
I bet.
So baby carriers are great, like top of the line strollers are great, but it's really not going to make the difference that feeling adequately prepared for postpartum will. There's so much that they just don't tell you. Everyone wants to tell you your birth story, but then no one wants to talk about postpartum. That's the part that they think is going to scare people.
Yeah. And I'll just shout out that a lot of the parents listening, since they're coming to me for sleep, already have one kiddo. This stuff can be really helpful to revisit for a second kiddo.
Oh yeah.
I've
had second, third, fourth time parents take this course and come back at me and be like, that just helped me process my entire first postpartum. Like now I understand what was happening.
Yep. And
Because
can
we
make
do,
difference.
we talk about those emotional stages and we talk about the physical recovery and just things that a lot of people just aren't prepared for because there's not a class that talks about it. We have breastfeeding classes, we have infant care classes, we have infant CPR classes, but I created this class because it's what I wish I had had.
I love that. Awesome. All of that stuff will be linked in the show notes. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, for talking through this all with me, and for sharing your insight with all the listeners.
No, it was fun. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope this episode left you feeling more informed, confident, and encouraged on your sleep journey. And just a reminder before you go that nothing in this episode is individualized to your specific sleep situation, nor is it to be taken as medical advice. Take what resonates, ignore what doesn't, and check with your healthcare provider about any medical concerns. Take a moment to subscribe to this podcast so that you'll never miss an episode. And take a moment to rate, review, or share an episode you love on social media. All of that helps parents just like you find me, this podcast, and this gentle and responsive sleep information. I'll see you next time.